film is called The Faraway Nearby, and it was directed by Paula M. Froehle of the United States. It was nominated for Best Feature Documentary and Best Science Film. Welcome to GeekFest, Paula, and also the editor, Sam Rong. We welcome you both. I wanted to start by asking you, Paula, this is a subject, I love biographies, I love documentaries, but I love science films. And one of the things that we talk about in science is that I always feel doesn't get enough respect is the part of science where we take a wild guess at things. And sometimes our guesses are right, and sometimes our guesses are wrong. You follow the life of Joseph Weber in this story. I need to ask you, first of all, how did you get in touch with this story? What motivated you to create this film?
Well, first off, thank you for that great question, and thanks to GeekFestUniverse for making us the opening film. Very excited for to share it and for the conversation. So how I came to this film started actually 25 years ago with a little book that's called Einstein's Dreams that was written by a physicist slash novelist by the name of Alan Lightman, who teaches at MIT. And I picked up this book, and it's all a very imaginative thinking about the kinds of dreams that Einstein had before he developed his theory of relativity about time. And I fell in love with the book and the storytelling, and I thought if I ever had the opportunity, I would love to adapt it to film. Fast forward, well, I reached out. Alan said no. And fast forward, I carried the book with me for 22 years. And a film that I was involved in through funding, they actually had interviewed Alan for their project. And I happened to mention that I had carried this book around, and I always thought about wanting to make this film. And they said, great, we'll get you in touch with him. I then mentioned this to my editor at the time, which was not Sam, unfortunately, but and that editor said, Alan Lightman, he was my dad's best friend when we were kids. And he texted him, and Alan texted right back. One thing led to another, and Alan and I met in Boston. And in the interim, I went back to Einstein's Dreams and realized, I was a very different person now, 22 years later, and it wasn't necessarily something I wanted to make into a film. And so I was a little nervous about meeting Alan. And when we sat down together, he said to me, well, I don't want to make a film about something I've written already. I want to start something new and like collaborate, have you make a film about a story that we're both interested in. And then he proceeded to tell me the story of Joseph Weber. And he started with the detail of Joseph Weber falling at the age of 80, falling in the ice in front of his lab. So starting with essentially his death and the tragedy of that moment, and working backward from there, the story of his pursuit and how dogged he was about it, and arguably how crazy he perhaps became in that process of trying to prove that he had detected gravitational waves, ending up in this place at the age of 80, where he slips and falls outside of his lab, that he's self-funding, he's been excommunicated from the scientific community, was just such a tragic human moment to me that I thought, this is a story that I really want to explore more and tell.
Now, the interesting thing about this film is, for you, I'm asking, it was the tragedy, the life of triumph followed by tragedy, or was it something else?
It was definitely the life of triumph followed by tragedy. That someone who had gained the kind of respect and notoriety that Joe Weber had early on in his career, to become so obsessed with trying to prove this last piece of the theory of general relativity that no one thought we would ever have instruments sensitive enough to detect, that he was the first one to say, you know what, I have an idea, I'm just going to go try it. And then believing he was successful, and then kind of losing perspective on and going against the scientific credo that if other people can't prove the same proof that you have, then it can't be published as truth. And kind of getting trapped up in the, many people say he fell in love with the idea of his discovery, and that clouded his objectivity. And other folks that I spoke with said, they all have emotional attachments to their work. And sometimes that can be a difficult thing to balance with the objectivity that's required for scientific discovery. So I was fascinated by that. And ultimately, what I realized over the course of making this film is that, we have lots of science stories about the folks who did make the discovery, of the ones who did get the Nobel Prize, but there aren't enough that are about the pioneers, about the first people who say, I'm going to risk everything to try and make this discovery. Whether I'm right or wrong, taking that first step, I mean, let's face it, it's much easier to do if someone's done it before you, has opened the door. And in this case, to me, what I was really interested in is trying to highlight this idea that it's really important to take these risks, whether you're right or wrong.
For me, one of the reasons I fell in love with this film is that I believe that one of the most important parts of science is being wrong, and that when we are able to be wrong and accept that we were wrong, that is the moment when the universe grows a little bit. So to me, I loved that, and I always feel like there's not enough respect about being wrong in science. So that to me, that to have a whole film about this, do you feel that Joseph Weber was a kooky old man?
I think that Joseph Weber was, in many ways, brilliant. And in that brilliance, figuring out, I mean, his tool, this giant aluminum bar that was going to be like a tuning fork for the universe. I mean, to conceptualize that idea, much less have it built and then, work on it and tweak it. I mean, that's a level of brilliance that I think a lot of pioneers really possess. I think that as he really believed that he had seen something. As it was unable to be replicated, he spent a lot of time trying to figure out what it was, but he refused to let go of the fact that it could be gravitational waves that he detected until someone was able to do that definitively outside of him. And that was never accomplished while he was alive. And so I don't necessarily see him as crazy. I think the excommunication from the scientific community certainly had an effect on his personality and made things difficult as he got older.
I wanted to ask Sam a question. There's a lot of really interesting effects and storytelling that happens in this film. For instance, there are a number of reenactments of the parts of Joseph Weber's life. How did you go about telling this story from the editor's point of view?
From the editor's point of view, it's a lot like how Joseph Weber kind of built the bar. It was really so much trial and error because given that it's so historical and things happened in the 60s and 70s before the advent of smartphone cameras and things that could just capture everything with the snap of a finger, it's a double-edged sword. You are, on the one hand, presented with so much textual archive. So in Joseph Weber's notebooks, and we knew that was going to be a key visual medium because that's one way the audience can connect to him is through his handwriting. And then the other archive we have were his voice recordings. So another piece that we can kind of flesh out his dimensionality. The other side of the double-edged sword that fell on us, though, is that we lacked a lot of visuals. And in the beginning, for Paula, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but your whole idea was that, well, we can use the reenactments to bring Weber to life in a way that the lack of historical footage or just photographs would never be able to do. And so much of it was just kind of getting the textual archive and then the sound in there as our backbone, and then figuring out the visual language as we went along, whether it was reenactments, whether it was sourcing stuff from all these universities that these scientists were affiliated with. And then piece by piece, we kind of just laid everything on top of each other.
So I would have some of these stories, and it was interesting that you chose to reenact the stories that you did. Some of the stories I wondered, why didn't you reenact him jumping up and down and stamping on the desk of the man wanting to get money from him? How did you choose which ones were the best reenactment material?
Well, definitely I knew that I wanted, and it ends up being a tiny piece in the film, but in many ways the reenactment idea started with the story of him losing his ability to speak when he was 5, when he was hit by a bus. That to me was a moment that I felt, while it's a small piece of the film, I always think of it as the beginnings of the idea for him that the universe is incredibly large. It can knock you off your feet, literally, by something you didn't see, didn't expect. It can completely shift the way in which you think about yourself in the world. In this case, he had to learn how to speak again. And I knew that I wanted even just a small moment of that literal impact, because I saw it as such a metaphor for what happens to him later in life. And that, of course, was going to require some degree of reenactment. One of the things that, just as an aside, those reenactments are done using the Unreal Engine for the scene backgrounds and the environments in which the actors are in. And the great thing about it is usually when I tell people that, they don't realize it. It's only in going back and looking at it again that you realize that those backgrounds, his lab, and some of those details are essentially on screens. They're projected. It's the same technology that The Mandalorian really made kind of prominent in Hollywood. And what I love about that is they're meant to not appear as detached from the actor. They're meant to immerse the actor in the moment so that the performance is more real. So that was really fun to work with as a tool. But also then in terms of the other things that were important to me, much of what I wanted to utilize the reenactments for was less about the literal specific moments and more about the emotional space that the process of discovery to me is all about. And the frustrations of that, but also some of the small triumphs, the moments when you think you've discovered something, whether you're an artist or a scientist, coming to this as an artist and a filmmaker, I found many parallels in that process of discovery and creation that were really important to me to integrate together.
Now, one of the things that I love so much about the film which I've already mentioned is the idea that science comes from being wrong. I assume you may or may not be aware of the current controversies in particle physics and string theory, where there is a sort of a rising tide of people saying, maybe this really isn't true. Have you thought about? Do you have an idea of to take this kind of story into another project?
You know, it's great that you asked that. It is fascinating to me, both the idea of being a pioneer and then the stories over time that are about moments. One that's told to me a lot is, I believe it's Cold Fusion, where there was this, again, this announcement that they had figured out how to do this, and then consequently it proved to be false, and all the dismantling that has to occur in the process of letting go of that. So I love the idea of continuing to focus on pioneers in particular, and all of the drama and the ups and downs of that, including especially the areas where they're wrong. So one of the things that I have been exploring is talking with, there's the next generation of essentially LIGO as a tool called the Einstein telescope that is being developed in Europe. And as a byproduct of the premiere in Louvain, I met several of the physicists and researchers who are involved in one of the locations where the Einstein telescope will be like LIGO, except it could potentially be triangular as opposed to L-shaped, and it would be buried underground, trying to get away from the vibrations that exist on the surface of the Earth, burying it in granite. And I'm fascinated by that idea. So I've been having conversations with them, which may turn into some aspect of the next project.
Wow, that I can't wait to see it. I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, Marc.
Thank you so much, Thomas. The French writer Marguerite Yourcenar once said, "C'est avoir tort que d'avoir raison trop tôt," meaning one is wrong to be right too early. Is this also the case with Joseph Weber?
It is wrong to be right too early. And is this the case with Joseph Weber? That's really an interesting question. And in many ways, if anything, I think that may have been the biggest issue, is that while it took him about a decade to fine-tune his tool enough for it to register anything that he couldn't rule out as, it registered at one point a car accident that happened a couple of miles away. It registered a minor earthquake in the ground. And for him to finally get to a point, it took about a decade. But when you're talking about something as tiny as a gravitational wave, in many ways, many people said it just happened too fast. And that's part of what got him so, the excitement of that distracted him to a point of, and the kind of renown that was afforded him around the world, the idea that there were tools being replicated all over the world, that kind of feeding of the ego, if you will, all centered around the idea that it maybe happened too quickly. I think that's a really good question.
Now, was Joseph Weber ever a theoretical physicist, or was he always an experimental physicist, or did he gradually go from one to the other?
Well, I'm sure you know this, that there is this, and I think it's commonly true and commonly held belief that you're either theorist or an experimentalist. And, Joe Weber came to all of this from being an engineer. And so arguably he's coming to it more from the sort of experimentalist side of building and trying out tools, but because so much he was the first, he also had to develop and explore some of the theoretical aspects of it. Many people say that he was a much better experimentalist than theorist, and that his belief that he was both also led to a bit of confusion about, and inability to back down.
Well, as we know, all scientists use mathematics, and you mentioned him as being an engineer. What kind of mathematics was he involved with, and did he have a large mathematical background, or was it more of an applied mathematics?
It was more of an applied mathematics. And again, one of the things that I found so interesting about him, and I think it's true in science, that there, like we like to think that there's a really clear path of, you going to university and you're studying a very specific path in terms of its mathematics or its physics or its theory or its application. And I think as I spoke with so many of these physicists, it's got kind of an amalgam of all of those things. And much of particularly pioneers is there's this mixture of stuff. I think for Joe, he developed into a physicist kind of by default of the work that he was doing, which was much more derived out of an applied mathematics.
Thank you. Now, in a completely unrelated field, how on earth did you get the rights to a Bowie song, Sam?
That is not my department. That is Paula's department. But that was an idea that she had from day one.
I mean, how can you not go after Starman? You know? And it was something that it took a little while, but I worked with a great music clearance person, but also I had the good fortune of, I believe his archive had been purchased by Sony maybe a year prior to when I asked for the rights. And the person who saw a cut of the film was a geek and loved the idea of tying it to the story. And so, yeah, that was quite a moment when we were able to use the song.
It's just so beautiful and perfect, contemporary, and perfect for the feeling that you're conveying. And I'm going to actually send this back to Thomas. I believe Thomas has another question.
Sam, I wanted to ask you more about the editing process and how's this unique, Joe Weber's story?
It took a level of imagination that I don't think any of my other projects have demanded thus far. It's a level of visual imagination. Just because gravitational waves are so, you can't see them, you can't touch them, you can't feel them or hear them or smell. And so I remember one of the intro scene with all the waves and the colors, like the monotone and the red and blue. The first day Paula and I kind of put that together, the whole time I was thinking, and I didn't express this to her because this was my second feature edit ever. And I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm gonna put some sound effects here. I'm going to put this waveform over here, maybe this monochrome circle that kind of bulges out over here. And let's press play and see what happens. And I think so much of editing, we think that, oh, the editor has it figured out. He knows exactly to put this music cue right here or drop this word right here and to let the piece breathe right here. No. From my experience, especially with this film, so much of it is like groping around the dark. You find something, you turn that light on, and then you start searching nearby. And then once you get traction, all these other lights start turning on. And so I think through this film, I found so much confidence in just being comfortable with not having an answer and being comfortable with the fact that a work in progress does not mean that it is somehow of lesser quality.
Damn, Sam, you're actually doing the same thing that the scientists are doing. You're kind of
so much of it is.
Dark. Yeah. I've always, as an editor myself, I've always said that when you're editing, doing a bad edit is not worse than doing no edit. So if you're sitting there waiting for this to be inspired to how these shots all fit together, you're getting literally nowhere. So I always say, yeah, you take one shot and you put it next to another shot and see what they look like. So I hear that that's what you were doing, and the film of course doesn't really appear that way. It has all these beautiful stylistic pieces to it, and the look and feel of the film looks really, really interesting. So how many times did you have to go back and find out that your first guess was wrong, just like Joseph Weber?
Oh, let's see. I have the old project file, the final project file. I think we had like 16 or 17 cuts of the film by the time everything was done. Okay. So it was a good number of watching it and just combing through. Documentary, I always tell people, documentary is like jumping off a cliff and then building an airplane on the way down. Except while you're building the airplane, like you have to conjure parts out of thin air, and then if you put a part in, something else comes out. And so much of it was that jigsaw of not necessarily putting the house of cards in the right order, but being careful enough not to like destroy the whole thing while you're putting it together.
And that's different from a narrative, and because the narrative usually has a story that you got to tell in a particular.
Yes.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
In documentary, the story is found in the edit.
Absolutely. I would add one other thing about Sam's experience that I think was really critical to this project, which is he's a classically trained pianist and he's quite good. And that sense that I think is required, not being a pianist at all, I could see a relationship between tempo and some of the other elements, which I can't cite by name, but there is a kinship between the way in which Sam plays piano and the way that he cuts. And within that, there's an emotional current that I think is true in both cases. I don't think that all classically trained pianists have that emotional current, but when you do, I think that it applies as you're cutting together picture. And I would say because documentary is so much found in the edit, it's most clearly revealed there. So I felt really fortunate, not knowing this before we started working together, but realizing it very quickly.
I have one last question before I send it back to our moderator. I wanted to ask you, there's that shot of the lab when people are actually going in and stealing his equipment and taking his equipment. Now, it's a little tongue-in-cheek, I thought, and it was fun. Where did that come from, and whose idea was that, and was that a lot of fun to make?
Well, yes, it was a blast, and it was something that came up in talk about being open to the unknown. It happened as I was watching, as we were shooting the reenactments, and we were shooting that final scene with him in the lab, trying to convey this sense of resignation and isolation and sadness. And I was looking in the monitor as people were setting up his table. And it just, the light bulb went off that actually doing this sort of taking away of running it in reverse, if you will, would potentially, we're here, we're on stage, let's shoot it and see what happens. And I just had, it was all set up, and I just told the folks to stand on either side of the stage, and I would call a number, and each of them had a number. And when I'd call their number, they would come in and they would grab whatever it was they felt like grabbing. And it played out. And Marc, the actor, who I think is just brilliant in his ability to communicate Joe Weber's emotional state, when he gets to that point where almost nothing is left and he's kind of breathing heavy, it was, everyone was emotional on the stage when we shot it. And it was one of those things where I loved it so much. And I know Sam and I talked about it in the edit about, I hope to God this isn't going to be one of those, as they call it, kill your babies moments. Like, I'm going to have to get rid of this, because I really, in so many ways, that scene does so much for me emotionally in terms of getting you to be right there with him, and how sad that moment really was. So yeah, inspiration in the moment, being open to it.
Very interesting. I'm going to send it back to Marc for a few more questions.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. Question for Sam. You're a classically trained pianist, and we a lot of us have heard the story that Einstein, we had a problem, he couldn't solve it, he just picked up the violin, and he did develop this extra part of it when they analyzed his brain. He has a little bit of a bump there where he was able to really use his musical abilities to view the world differently. Did you run to your piano every time you had an editing issue?
So, funny you should mention this. So this electric piano that I have back here, I actually bought this while I was editing Faraway Nearby. Not because it inspired me to do it in any way, but while that was happening, I was also while I was editing Faraway Nearby, I picked up the piano for the first time in 12 years. And I started practicing it again. And I started learning a piece by Franz Liszt. And as I was learning, and as I was kind of analyzing how Liszt wrote phrasing, wrote chord changes, how he brought themes back over and over again in his piece. I was like, this is not too different from a film at all. And so, given how classical composers wrote their pieces, I thought to myself, well, maybe there's a way that we can run the parallels into the film as well. So whether it was, the frantic scribbling of his notebooks that we kind of put in time and time again, or there's some other moments that the spinning stars, it just kind of reminded me that, you can put a theme with a variation in a longer piece that at one point may resonate one way with the audience, but then as the story evolves, it might resonate differently at a different point in time in the story. And I think I was studying film structure and musical structure at the same time while editing this film.
Oh, amazing, Sam. Now, unless you're an incredible polymath, which you probably are, I don't believe you have a PhD in physics. So how much method editing did you do, like method acting? How many books, how many websites, how many films, how many rabbit holes did you go down to self-learn physics on while doing the editing?
So I want to say like three years before I did Faraway, I was working at the University of Chicago, and I had to do a piece on one of the scientists who was actually working with LIGO. And so while doing that, he kind of showed me, redshifts and galaxies, how the wavelength kind of just like, it's like a Doppler effect or whatever. And then I think growing up, I've always been fascinated by supernova, just the fact that stars can explode. There was actually a scene in the film about Joseph Weber discovering a supernova that we had to take out for narrative sake. But science has always kind of been in and out of my mind. So while the material was foreign, it didn't feel that, no pun intended, far away.
Awesome. So you're a true Renaissance man. Wonderful. Now, you managed to give me goosebumps. That whole scene when LIGO, where they finally get the result, I got those goosebumps watching that. What a wonderful way to get the crescendo and get us to watch failure after failure, and all of a sudden, there it is. What a brilliant way to put it together. So I can confirm I got goosebumps as well. Did you get goosebumps, Sam, when you're doing this?
I remember so before we started the edit process fully, I went to Paula's place, and she had just finished the reenactments, and she showed me that long shot of Joseph Weber getting all his stuff taken away. And underneath it, she played a Bach, I want to say a Bach cello and piano duet. Mm-hmm. It was a D minor cello and piano duet. And I remember tearing up. I remember feeling so heartbroken for the man that you had put decades of your life into building this house of cards only for people kind of just like mercilessly tearing it apart. And that kind of spoke to me, because as artists, we put so much of our hearts and souls into a piece of work. And we do become very attached to it. And so I think that was the moment where I was like, yeah, Joseph Weber, his journey is worth the telling.
Now, Paula, I did some research as well. I went down some rabbit holes, and I found out he's a Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrant with no birth certificate. How much of this faceted his identity and his personality, if you think it did?
I mean, I think the ways in which it did, I mean, there are folks who believe that he sort of had a chip on his shoulder. And I think perhaps some of that could be anchored in some of that aspect of his being. I think that it then could have been, and I love the idea that we can't say definitively. Like, one of the things I also found so fascinating about its story is that there were many different perspectives on why he went down the road he did with gravitational wave discovery, that why he wouldn't give in. And one was that he had this chip on his shoulder that was only made, and so he came from these very humble beginnings. He came into physics as an engineer, so he doesn't have the traditional through line of training that other physicists did. And then he has this early theoretical understanding of the maser, describing and talking about how the maser, which eventually becomes the laser, could be formulated. And because he wasn't the one who physically demonstrated it, he wasn't the experimentalist with the maser, he never got the credit and he never got the Nobel Prize. And even there's some question about the folks who did perhaps taking that or hiding and burying his work with regard to it. So the chip gets bigger, and then coming into gravitational waves and being met with, a lack of, pushback on the inability to replicate. Many people felt like he's got such a big chip on his shoulder that it's being added to. He's seeing this opposition as falling in line with all of the other slights or ways in which he didn't have equal standing when he came into the field. And so I think that's a very interesting and frankly a very human response and reaction. Maybe not to the extreme that he took it, but I think again, to go back to at the core of this, I feel like it's a very human story, as Jana Levin says toward the end. These science discovery pursuit stories are human stories. And I also think, as a dabbler in science geeky, the side of me, I feel like it's so important for us to understand the humanity that is beneath this pursuit of these universal truths. And if we can tap into more stories like this, then we can keep the excitement of becoming a scientist, becoming a physicist, discovering things about the world. We can keep that alive through grade school, high school, college, and we can all benefit from an environment that supports taking risks like this and being emotionally connected to those risks that you're going to take.
Well, it's such a universal story. This is the prisoner who got out of Plato's cave and was ridiculed when he came back down. What a beautiful universal story based on a wonderful, wonderful scientist who's finally getting his due today. And thanks to you as well. So I really appreciated this film, and thank you so much for coming to GeekFest. And I'll hand this over to the moderator.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much, Thomas and Marc, for those great questions, and Paula and Sam for your great responses. Paula, you directed a docudrama. That's what this film is. Can you explain the differences in direction between directing for a documentary and directing for a narrative film?
Well, that's a really good question. Yeah, some of it goes to what Thomas was saying, and that with a narrative film, you're mapping things out on paper, and to a certain extent, you need some of that basic framework from which to then direct and work with actors and helping them to get inside of characters and situations and internalize them as if they're true. For documentaries, I mean, so much of it is like Sam described, where it's like you're digging in, you're going down rabbit holes, you're trying to find the elements of things that, like, there'll be these little magical details that will reveal something about the person that you're, if it's a biography of sorts, it's like you're looking for evidence or things that might suggest a quality within that person that you're trying to bring to life in the film. It's really wonderful to work for me in a hybrid form because I love both of those processes of discovery.
Thank you for that answer. By the way, Paula, please give a shout out to your actor, Kip Thorne.
Kip Thorne is actually the Nobel laureate who was part of LIGO, who made the first true discovery of a gravitational wave. But I will give a giant, he is one of the most dear humans I have ever met. One of the benefits of having made this film is crossing paths and becoming dear friends with Kip. He's the most humble human I've ever met, and he's the most brilliant brain I think I've ever engaged with. So he will
Thank
love
you.
that there was a mention. Thank you.
Thank you. Paula, you're an artist and a filmmaker. Is this why this film in particular has so many artistic storytelling devices in it?
Absolutely. I found so many parallels as I spoke with physicists about the discovery process, the unknown, what it takes, the as Sam was describing his process, it's all so familiar. It may have different results at the end, but that process of discovery is the same. And as an artist, I came to film as through an experimental filmmaking program. So Sam and I would always talk about how the first 2 minutes of the Faraway Nearby is essentially an experimental film. And I love that I was able to bring that forward. I haven't made experimental films for probably 20 years, but it was wonderful to have this ability in trying to bring somebody into the experience of a gravitational wave to do it in this very abstract and experimental fashion.
Sam, you were mentioned here in this response by Paula. Can you again walk us through a little more on the decision-making and process and collaboration with Paula on when to include those visual elements and live action footage, animation, and so on?
It goes back to the old saying of too much is a good thing is probably not a good thing anymore. And so we had to kind of make them out to be accent points, because most of the time you still wanted the story to be grounded in as much reality as possible. But even then, the idea of reality, we put in large quotations, because what is reality if space-time can be warped? What is reality if the very laws of physics are changing based on human interpretation? And so there was a scene where Ray Weiss, one of the LIGO scientists, was talking about the technology that was needed to build the bar, and how Einstein didn't have access to that technology, but Joe Weber somehow did. And so instead of just putting literal representations of technology, Paula found this wonderful shot of these human hands putting kitchen appliances inside this tiny little kitchen. And we thought that just the strangeness and the quirkiness of that shot really spoke to the spirit of the film, because discovery is strange. Stumbling upon the novel is strange. And so anytime we can mix reality with not so much fantasy, but just kind of just warp it just a little bit to keep you on the edge of the seat, we're always about that.
This question is for both of you. Who would you consider to be the next Joseph Weber? Do you know of another scientist who's finally getting his or her recognition today?
Wow, that's a big one. I want to call my friend Kip and ask him. I don't know that I could say one person. Sam may have an idea. I will say that we need the next Joe Weber. We need a lot of Joe Webers. We need a lot of pioneers these days. We need support for people taking risks like he did. I think we live in a culture that is trying to tamp down too much on experimentation and taking risks. I can do a whole thing on cancel culture. I think that it's unfortunate that young people are growing up in an environment where it's scary to actually take a risk, say something, put something out there creatively that may not be received well. I think we do ourselves a disservice, and we will lose a generation of creativity if we don't champion more pioneers and more people taking risks.
Thank you so much. Sam, you want to weigh in?
I just want to say that the next Joe Weber is not going to be a name on our lips, because whoever that person is, they are fighting the fight of their lives right now in that struggle of finding and pushing the boundary. And so Next Joe Weber we might know in, what is it, 2025 now? We might know in 2085 who the next Joe Weber is.
Sam, what have you learned about yourself through the making of this film?
What have I learned about myself? A lot of this film was me killing my perfectionist side, because I come from a journalism background. I was raised by extremely strict Chinese immigrant parents who demanded nothing except, journalism demanded nothing except the truth, and the truth told in the highest quality. My parents demanded nothing but the best from me. And the filmmaking process was so much of, hey, Paula, let's just film something as a stand-in right now on an iPhone and we'll figure it out later. So much of it is we'll figure it out later. But the most important thing is just to do something now. Even if your perfectionist instincts tell you, yeah, but what you do now isn't that good. What isn't that good has the potential to become great, but what is not will never have the potential to become what is not that good.
Sam, thank you so much for that answer. Paula, what have you learned about yourself through the making of this film?
I think that through the making of this film, what I learned to do was to put aside, it's similar, I think, to what Sam was saying, to put aside this critical voice that I think we all carry, that is coming from many different sources that can keep you from making mistakes, being wrong. It can keep you from trying. The fear of being wrong and the fear of like, that doesn't work at all. The fear of that, the ego wants to protect itself so much. I really felt through the process of this film many times literally saying to that portion of my brain, you go sit over here for a while. We'll come back to you, maybe, at some point, but you're actually not that important. What's more important is this one that is open to discovery. Be happy and be comfortable with what you find there. And yeah, and then look for a great, great collaborator, companion on the path, as I did with Sam Rong.